Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of computational neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Alex.
And I'm Josh.
And the topic for this episode is, can a biologist fix a radio? And that topic title comes from the title of a paper, which will kind of be the main focus of what we're discussing. So that paper is titled, Can a Biologist Fix a Radio? Or What I Learned While Studying Apoptosis. So this is a paper that was written in 2002 by Yuri Lazebnik, who is a cancer cell biologist at Cold Spring Harbor. And so it was published in the journal Cancer Cell. It's a correspondence, not like a real research paper. And it's only 3.5 pages, but it kind of lays out this, I guess, critique of how biology is done and how biologists understand things, centered around asking if a biologist could fix a radio. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about kind of a sequel or follow-up that came in 2017, which is the paper called Could a Neuroscientist Understand a Microprocessor? So a more specific example of the question, and that is by Eric Jonas and Conrad Cording, and that was in PLOS Computational Biology. So the first paper, I think, is like kind of well known. I'm not actually sure. I looked it up. It has like 370 citations, but it also seems like something that biologists would read, but not necessarily cite for anything, because it's kind of like the philosophy of biology in a way. I know that in the PhD program in neuroscience at Columbia, they have the first or second year. We had to read this as one of the classes that we take. So I know people in Columbia's neuroscience program, so that would be Josh and I, had read it. Alex, when did you first hear about this paper?
I first heard about this paper when I read the Neuroscientist microprocessor paper, and it was in the introduction.
Oh, yeah. So I guess that makes sense that this second paper would cause a resurgence of people looking at the first one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do get the sense that people, at least maybe especially when it first came out, like the people who were practicing then have heard about it and talk about it, because it is a nice example of, it's like a meta science discussion of like how people do their science, that I feel like maybe doesn't, I don't know, I feel like I don't see as many examples of this today, but maybe this was rare for its time as well, this like style of paper. Okay, so the way that the paper kind of goes about is the radio comparison kind of happens as the second part. The first bit of it is talking about the way a field in biology progresses. So this is, as I said, someone who is studying apoptosis, which is like programmed cell death when cells choose to kill themselves, that process. So the author was entering this field and had felt that, there was so much progress happening that by the time he got his lab set up, there'd be like no questions left about apoptosis, because it was in this like boom time for this particular topic. And so he asked for advice from a guy named David Papermaster, which I think is a cool last name.
It's good for academia, definitely.
Yeah. And so he asked him for advice because this was like an older scientist. And so this guy said that, all fields progress a certain way in these certain stages. And he went on to explain what the stages are. And so the author relays to us what those stages are. And so it's basically like, there will be some small topic area that not a lot of people are studying, and it's considered esoteric, kind of like an offshoot of some main field. And so the people who study it are leisurely in their study. There's not a lot of pressure or anything like that, and they're generally nice to each other. That was also part of it. But then some finding happens in that subfield that draws attention from other people and makes people think that there's a lot of promise in that subfield and that they should pay more attention to it. And so then it enters into this gold rush era, which is when a bunch of people come in and everyone's trying to find like the next big advance, something that will end up in textbooks of the future. And so there's a bunch of people working on it, and there's a bunch of papers that are being published all the time.
And people aren't as nice to each other.
Yes, people become less nice in this gold rush period, as they probably were in the actual gold rush period. And so in this time, this was like roughly the stage that apoptosis was in when this guy was joining it. And at that time, they said there were 10,000 papers per year on apoptosis being published. And also at this time, there is models that are being developed, like a sense of how things work. And these models are simple and neat, and they seem to capture a lot of findings. And I think that's why this guy had the sense that, like, there wouldn't be any questions left because there was, so much progress and things were going great. And then people keep producing way too much research, or a large amount of research. I won't be judgmental about the right amount. And then all of a sudden, the findings from these neat, simple models start to fail. They aren't predicting the data correctly. The data appears to be more complicated. And things get overwhelming, and he says this is where you enter into this paradoxical phase where the more facts we learn, the less we understand.
But this is okay, right? This is just like a classic paradigm shift view of systems biology. Is this necessarily bad?
I think the part that's bad is this last step where the models break down. I think a paradigm shift could start with like the first finding that draws people into a field, and then you have a gold rush, and then, ideally you walk away from that with some like actual gold, like some real models that work. But then there's this next stage where the models fall apart.
I would say that the models breaking down is the useful stage, because then you see what is not quite right about your understanding, and then you can progress to a better understanding.
I think the setup that this is trying to produce is less about like generically for all forms of science, perhaps. And I think this is a targeted critique of biology, with the idea being that so far in biology, people have had boom times in response to oversimplified narratives about how a certain biological system works. And so far, there, according to this criticism, there have been few things in biology that have really been nailed. And the reason for that is because the sort of scientific method has oversimplified certain things, and people have published extensively around these sort of simplified models. And where this is headed, is to sort of criticize the methodology of biologists. Like, I think this actually is meant to be a targeted critique, not a statement about how all science progresses.
Yeah, so I guess what you're saying is that unlike maybe physics, where you would have this same like models breaking down and then progressing to another model, but you keep something of the original, like a nugget of the original model.
Yeah, it's like subsumed by the new model.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas here, maybe in systems biology, the criticism is that you're moving from model to model without
making as much forward progress.
Yeah.
I mean, there's clearly still progress being made, but yeah,
at a lower rate.
It's lower rate, and there's more breakdown where people realize maybe actually what we're approaching isn't even the right way of thinking about it. And I think this is the targeted criticism of biology or subfields within biology.
I guess I'm not sure. Like, I was trying to think about this happening in neuroscience. I can't tell if that's like what all of neuroscience is now. Like, are we in some sort of gold rush, or are we in the models are breaking down period? I'm not really sure, because I guess what was surprising to me is this claim that there is this period where you can make these simple models and they do explain stuff. Like, there's this period where it's working, and then all of a sudden something happens and the data that you get doesn't fit. Is it that people were not accurately looking at their data? Like, they were doing kind of a first order understanding of their data. And after that was like thoroughly explored, like all the low-hanging fruit was captured, then they started actually looking at it in detail, and that's when it fell apart? Or like, what is the transition that makes it such that you're now collecting data that doesn't align with the models? Is it actually something about the data, or is it that you weren't really like thinking through on the models? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I took this as more of a loose, almost rhetorical point rather than something we might like. I don't necessarily think we should linger on this sort of progression of the fields, in the sense that my read of it was more that this was like a almost caricature framework rather than something that they were the authors really advocating in detail.
I mean, he's at least like, I think what he's trying to go on to explain and talk about is this paradoxical phase where more information gives you, or more data gives you less understanding, more information gives you less understanding. So I feel like it is important to understand that phase, and like if we feel that that's happening now, I mean, assuming using neuroscience as an example.
But I also think it's important because it maybe is related to the complexity of the system that we're trying to understand in systems biology. as compared to in physics. But maybe this is a point we can return to after we talk a little bit more about the papers.
Yeah, in biology, you get to this point where the fundamental complexity of the system makes it difficult for the simple statements that people have made about that system to hold up to further scrutiny. And I think that's almost as like, that's to me the framing of this. The framing of this article is biology is complicated and people will approach it and try to make simple first order statements. And people get excited when one of those feels informative transiently before they then think, maybe that statement wasn't as valuable as we were led to believe initially, or we let ourselves believe initially.
That, yeah, I guess this is also related to, Alex, your point that, comparing it to physics and do things stay when you progress. It seems like this gold rush period where there are very simple statements that are made that capture some amount of the data, it doesn't seem like those do stick. Like the general trends that maybe are successful probably aren't a big part of necessarily what remains after things have been thoroughly explored, because you're probably just looking at a very small subset of a very complex system, and the things you pull out from there won't be generally applicable, just like the odds are that they likely won't be. So it almost does feel like the phase where people think they understand something, there might actually be very little of that remains, but obviously it probably depends on the specifics of the subfield. But right, so we can talk about the rest of this paper that actually goes on to do this kind of radio comparison. So basically the author says that, if you want to kind of understand how something works or understand a principle, you should take a case where you know the answer and kind of see if the principle holds in the case where you know the answer. And so what he did was say like, I had this broken radio in my house and I want to think about this process that biologists go through to understand things. If I applied it to this radio where I do know the ground truth, I know the answer of how it works, would I ever get to that answer by thinking like a biologist? And so that's kind of what the rest of the paper is. So he has like a picture of this radio, like the figures in this paper are a picture of a radio and a picture of a radio opened up. And so he kind of just like goes through like, how would a biologist go about this? What would a biologist do if they were handed this thing? And kind of assuming that they were treating it, like a cell.
Like a cell or a small, system or something like this.
So he actually like kind of says clearly how he intends it to relate. So the idea is that it's like a signal transduction pathway in a cell because it transduces EM waves into sound waves. That's what like the purpose of the radio is. And then he said that it's composed of like hundreds of resistors and capacitors and that kind of stuff, and cell pathway probably has hundreds of molecules involved. So from his perspective, it's like equally complicated to some cell signaling pathway. And then he says that like the only thing that the biologists know is that it's supposed to play music. So that's kind of their readout of if it's functioning. I guess the same way like broadly what the output of a cell signaling pathway is supposed to do. I like that he said the first step in doing this would be to get funding to buy a bunch of identical radios.
And yeah, the nature of the kinds of experimental investigations that the author proposes biologists would find natural are more sort of like qualitatively motivated knockouts or ablations or things like this, which would be standard in signaling pathway analysis, where you would say, block some molecule from being produced or having its effect, and seeing how that perturbation affects the sort of gross overall behavior, global behavior.
What I think was also interesting is that he talks a bit about maybe the politics or the more human nature side of it, where one person, a postdoc by chance, finds a wire that's where if you cut it, then the music stops playing, and then that is the most important component of the system until someone else finds a more important component system, and then they start arguing about which one is really the one most important system, whereas in reality we know that all of these units need to be working together in order for the radio to function. And I guess this is part of the reason that it's so complex to be able to break down such complex systems into the interacting parts. I thought that was quite realistic, sadly.
In that example, there was some talk of like, like this postdoc found this one wire that was needed to work. And then another postdoc found a different thing, and they claimed that they could cut the wire and it still worked, like the wire that the other person found was important. And it turns out that there was like a switch on the radios, and depending on which position the switch was in, either you needed the wire or you needed the other thing. So like all the crazy context dependency that can happen, and how you can have things that like seemingly are at odds, like just different labs saying completely different things when from what they're describing, they're doing the same experiment or they're working with the same organism or the same setup. But in actuality, there are aspects of the setup or the organism that differ that aren't being reported on because people don't even know that it's an important difference.
This seems to really parallel what's been happening recently in systems neuroscience, to me at least. Do you guys agree with this? With the kind of integration of more like contextual information, changing how we view different regions, such as visual cortex, where historically, well, I mean, maybe not that historically, but until very recently, we thought that visual cortex was just processing visual input as like the kind of first stage in sensory processing. And more recent evidence that there's like cross-modal information or contextual information, behavioral information, motor information, because it's all part of this like interlooped system.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of exactly that, because there's all these studies about how the activity of different neurons changes when an animal is running or not in like visual cortex, and different labs like had opposite results basically in different circumstances. And it turns out it depended on exactly what the visual stimulus was or something like that, like things that you would think, oh, it's a general principle that when an animal is running, activity in its visual cortex goes up. And it's like, well, no, it does when you show this kind of stimuli, and it doesn't when you do the visual stimuli differently or something like that. So it is like finding these switches that we think are unimportant but are actually causing differences. That's like a major discovery to find that out, even though a lot of times it just seems like some experimental nuisance. Like, oh, like I'm doing it wrong because I'm not getting the same result as the other lab.
Yeah, exactly. But then using this same logic of how we would apply, this type of experimentation to the system, then the worst case scenario, we just have like a huge lookup table of like, this is the exact context, and this is the visual stimulus, and this is the firing rate of the neuron.
Yeah, I feel like we need that. Like that's not the end
I'm not saying that, no, we do. Yeah,
I
I would be really happy if we had that lookup table, but I guess it feels like something is lacking. Not that I know how to fill that thing, but
yeah, you need to take the lookup table and turn it into like a model of how the system works as a unified thing that, is the same system just in different circumstances. But even making the lookup table, we don't really do, because we, like the way papers are presented, they don't lend themselves that well to being like really clear on what the difference between two papers is. Like papers just describe what they do, and you have to sort through supplemental material to see what differences there might be.
Yeah, and there could be so much that's not even necessarily included in detail in the paper because it may not have been viewed as very important, like, I don't know, about the rearing of the animal.
God.
The way, yeah.
Don't even start. So yeah, so the radio example is like, it works well. It's a nice way to talk about it because it detaches you from things. Like reading the ways people would approach the radio, some of the things seemed reasonable to me. Like the lesion experiments of cutting stuff and seeing if it matters. Like that's a decent way to start figuring things out, I feel like. And especially if you're trying to fix it, to like know what breaks it and know what doesn't break it.
Okay, so largely I agree, and I mean I don't want to sound totally critical because I enjoyed this paper and think that a lot of the social things that it captures are relevant. But I think this paper to me is a satire. Like I don't read this and take it so seriously at the detail level. To me, the paper makes very strong and fairly like dramatic, almost melodramatic statements, and the way that it is depicting the social dynamics of science seem, by reference to such like this simple system as a radio, it's trying to be it's trying to be provocative or like almost mocking the researchers, as I think the conclusions near the end of the paper kind of explicitly get at. What I think is counterintuitive about this, and I think where the paper ultimately heads when the guy talks about how an engineer would approach this and how it's different from the way a bioscientist would, is like ablation studies aren't a very reasonable thing to do for this system. If you believe the system was designed by people and has a small number of functional parts, and you can extract the sort of design principles that would go into the design of a system like this that people would have built, you would approach the experimental perturbations very differently. You would come in with like theories about why things might work the way they do, which maybe parallel more the way certain people come at their experiments motivated by evolutionary narratives or things like this. I don't want to overstate the.
But I thought this part of the paper was really unfair because, yeah, an engineer knows how the radio works.
Well, we'll get to like what his conclusions are, but I think to the point of are ablation studies reasonable, I mean, it does depend on how you think the system works, but you're trying to figure out how the system works. And to me, I mean, I guess these are just based on assumptions that I have already. Like, ablation seemed not crazy, like as a broad strokes thing to do. When he talked about kind of like chunking the system up and studying parts in isolation, for some reason that seemed crazy to me when thinking about a radio. Like, you can't just like pull things out and like hope that they work the same way, but obviously we do that in neuroscience. Like, you study cells and dish and just like try to understand individual neurons. So it was just funny to me to see when it was framed as a radio, my like reactions to things were different. He also talks about how really the first thing that biologists would do would categorize things by how they look. Like, oh, there are red bits and blue bits, and there are circular things with like spidery legs and, you know, the bits of a electrical circuit. And obviously that is what we would do. That's how neuroscience started. Like, Ramon Cajal just drew neurons and was like, hey, these look different. I wonder what that's about. And that sounds silly, like to say like I'm just gonna like describe what things look like in here, but then at the same time it's not a terrible idea.
Yeah, it's not crazy. I mean, and all these things are also, they're limited by like the methods that you have. So when you don't have really fancy like perturbative optogenetics back in the day, then you could pretty much lesion something. I mean, that's a good idea, I think.
They're limited by both the methods you have and the theoretical insights that you bring to it, right?
Yeah,
in the case of a radio, like an engineer would be able to look at the inside of a radio and have some sense of where other humans may have put certain pieces, or when they see pieces of, you know, that look a certain way, they will resemble pieces in other systems that look a certain way.
But wait, let's talk about it as though you're just handed a radio.
Yes,
like,
for the first time. Like, you don't have a blueprint.
handed a radio. You've never met an engineer. You've never seen an engineering textbook. You are handed a radio. Because that's what biology is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit more than that, because you have the functioning system, as is the case with this one.
So the premise is he has a broken radio that he's trying to fix, but then he immediately says he would get a bunch of radios that work and see what breaks them to try to understand them.
The premise that you're going to fix a broken radio without knowing anything about working radios, I think, is like not the case. And so in biology, the starting point, as some people have made the point, ethologists have felt for a long time, you know, you start by characterizing the behavior of a healthy system to some extent, and maybe even compare across systems with, you know, differently structured brains, so you have some sense of what kinds of principles or components are likely to go into the kinds of systems that produce behavior in bodies. Yeah, you might do ablations, and certainly when you have no theoretical background, maybe that like is the right thing to do, and it's partially confirmatory. You know, that's kind of the dogma of models in biology, is like, you know, you need to do knockouts to confirm.
Well, if you can't fix a broken radio, you can at least break a working radio.
Yeah,
I think that's fair to start.
I mean, it's just the inverse. So
yeah, exactly.
But as both of you have pointed out, right, like there are many ways to break something, and for it to work well, maybe requires the sort of specific coordination of a bunch of different working parts. I guess, yeah, there's two ways to read this kind of article, and I'm honestly not sure which. One is that it's a satire, and there are certain social elements or methodological elements that we should take away. You should sort of look at your field a bit from the outside, prompted by the sort of mockery that this thing provides you. The other is to believe, and I'm not sure I do, that this specific model is actually a good model of the kind of thing you would want to investigate.
Well, no, it's not. I'm not saying that actually thinking about how radio works is that helpful for neuroscience, but as is the point of any satire, it's supposed to frame comfortable, familiar beliefs in a different light so that you scrutinize them
Yeah,
properly.
I agree. Yeah.
And so that's what I was saying. It was interesting to see like methods of biology applied to a radio and see my reaction to them. That's kind of the point of the new framing of the same ideas. And another thing that kind of stood out for me on that was talking about like measurement, because they were talking about, okay, the thing it does is play music. What happens if you, like they're talking about the different colored pieces, what happens if you replace the like blue pieces with red pieces instead? And I don't know how radio really works, and this paper doesn't explain it. He just kind of makes these references to things like as though you'll know what part of the radio he's talking about. But he was saying that if you switch the colors of the pieces, then it still plays music, but it's like a little bit fuzzy, like it's clearly distorted. And I think maybe that's like changing the resistance of some of the bits. I'm not sure. The point is that that to me represents like being clear on what you're measuring. So if you're saying, does it still work? Like, what does work mean? Does it play any music at all? Does it mean that it plays it in this exact way? Like, you have to know what you're measuring as your output to determine if the perturbation that you did had an impact or not. And you should ideally kind of define that in advance and be clear on what your measurement is, and be clear that everyone's using the same measurement if they're claiming that they're measuring the same thing.
I think that's a good point, and that's certainly why later in the paper it's basically a plea for formalism within systems biology. However, I think that what complicates this is that thinking again that we're being handed, we're an alien who's being handed a radio. Is that the idea?
That's not his framing, but I think that's a reasonable framing. Yeah, that's my framing.
Yeah, but then we also, it's not just that we don't know how the radio works, but we also don't know what the radio is for, right? And so saying...
And I think that's too much. I think it's...
There's no hope then?
Yeah, I think if you are...
But that's neuroscience.
No, I don't think that's the case. That's what I was trying to say. Like, I think the brain of a specific organism, we know a lot about what it's for.
Tell me.
Well, no, I mean, like, animals produce behavior.
But what behavior? What's important? What is important
And
behavior?
what's just like kind of the random thing that it produces when it's not doing important things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's like simple, and I'm not saying that I could describe it in a single sentence, because I don't think that would really make sense. The animals do many different things in order to survive. But I mean, we do have a nice theoretical background for this. I mean that in the qualitative sense, right? There is evolutionary biology where, and in many cases there are specific, somewhat well thought through motivations for how animals got to be the way that they are in order to inhabit certain niches, perform well in their environment. So like when you talk about a specific organism, you can look at its life cycle, the things that it needs to do in order to survive and reproduce, and you can get a decent sense of what its nervous system is likely going to need to support. So you can't just ask me like, tell me what it's like. No, for each organism that you wish to study, right? You have to look at its environment. You have to look at the kinds of other intelligent animals that it interacts with, what it's preyed upon, what it preys upon, what kinds of signals those animals give off, what kinds of things that animal needs to be attuned to in order to perform well in its environment.
I don't think it's so clear. I mean, given that ethology is still a very active field of research, but I think I take your point that we do know kind of overall, and maybe that's very possible for simpler organisms with smaller, like C. elegans, for example. But I think that it gets even more complicated for mammals and
yeah, I agree. I mean,
where you basically have
animals
to study
that are complicated do lots of things. So to say that the brain, like, how can we understand? Well, I mean, I think it's a strictly easier problem to characterize the set of things that an animal does than it is to understand the system that produces that wide, diverse, adaptive set of behavior. So, I mean, from a certain perspective, I think we're probably largely in agreement. But I mean, from my perspective, it's definitely easier to simply characterize the range of behavior of, let's say, a rodent than it is to understand how the full brain produces the full diversity of context-specific behaviors that rodent produces. Right? One is like, how does it do everything that it does? The other is just, what does it do? And so I think people have shied away. I mean, it's only recent that we can even have a hope of recording long-term behavior measures of things like constantly monitor the behavior of an animal, which gives you a sense of the statistics of its behavior over long timescales, and then you can begin to probe it. But more what people have quantifiably, yeah, more what people have done in the past is say, well, animals in these very specific contexts do something fairly narrow. I know that if I, put a rat in a box where I shock its paw, it's going to have a somewhat stereotyped across animals. It's going to have a somewhat stereotyped response. So I'm going to take this, specific context that's highly reproducible, and I'll study something about the neural mechanisms that underpin behavior in that relatively rigid and stereotyped setting. But, as we can actually characterize a wider set of behavior, characterizing what the brain does in that wider set of behavior becomes more challenging because there's more that it has to do. But I guess it could also be in some ways less challenging because we're actually seeing the full dynamic range of activity of the circuit that's producing the behavior.
And I think the idea, though, is supposed to be not just what is the full set of things that an animal does. We're framing it kind of as like, what is it for? So presumably a subset of what it does is what it's quote unquote for, or what is really core to it. I mean, it doesn't really make sense, obviously, because evolution doesn't, it's not designed. It just emerges. But if we're going to make any comparison to like what a radio is for, that's different than the set of things it does. Because an alien could pick up a radio, and I think like just normal interactions with it, you could end up turning it on or whatever, but maybe they think that a radio is for producing static white noise because that's what they get most of the time when they turn it on. And then they spend their lives understanding how it produces static. And that you could say that that's what we're doing with animals. Like we have these weird lab animals that aren't doing kind of their natural behaviors, and we're trying to understand how they produce the weird behaviors.
No, I mean, I'm trying to stick to your sort of alien kind of example. You drop a radio in the ocean, and there's some creature like a dolphin or an octopus that has to figure out what a radio does. And
I don't think it's going to work in the ocean.
That's the point. Yeah, no, it won't work. And I would apply this to animals too. If you take an animal out of its habitat, you take a rodent which roams over large spaces, burrows in underground, and you expect to characterize the kinds of things that its brain can do when it's like housed permanently in a box that's non-ethologically sized, and where you give it food pellets and give it water. Right?
Wait, but surely it depends on what behavior you're interested in. Like social behavior, yes, but just, simple like movements or
I'm
goal-directed,
I'm kind of agreeing with you. Like, yes, if you pick a very narrow subset of behavior that the animal is capable of doing, even in a non-natural habitat or something like this, then yeah, sure, you can study that in isolation. But you're not really studying, when you study that, what the brain does. You're studying a probably far too powerful system and looking at like a degenerate subspace of what it can produce. So like it's like hearing white noise from a radio and studying that. I mean, maybe that is a good analogy because you're a radio. I mean, a radio isn't actually that complicated of a system, so it's not like the behavior of an animal. But a radio can play lots of different songs if sent the right signals. A broken radio or a radio that is not receiving the proper signals will, fuzz and give you white noise. If we extend this, metaphor very, very liberally without, me being scrutinized for the intellectual inadequacy of this metaphor.
We are all scrutinizing you.
I'm sure, yeah. Then I would say that an animal is similar to this, right? An animal in a highly impoverished environment, not receiving the kinds of stimuli, not in the kind of rich environment that it would be in nature, is producing a degenerate subspace of fuzz in response to its limited stimulus.
And this is really just an extension of what we were saying before about how the parts of the system interact in very complex ways. And, if you remove one part, it's going to be in a different behavioral regime. Or if an animal is running while it looks at visual stimuli, it's in a different neural regime. We're just kind of including the environment as part of the complex aspects of the system.
Yes, but those are that's a very simple environment, running or not, which is, that's not the same as it growing up, is that a weird thing to say for an animal?
Oh,
for being reared.
Okay, yeah, we just say reared.
Reared in like a richer kind of environment with more social interaction with other animals. I mean, it's not clear at this point if social interaction modulates visual processing, for example.
Yeah, and that's obviously an aspect that we can't extend to the radio metaphor because we don't think that they're developed. Like, it's not. There's nothing that we can say about that here, but I'm sure if he could, the author of this would have talked about that as well. But we can kind of go back to the paper. His conclusion, it seemed to me, was that no, a biologist wouldn't be able to fix a radio, in large part due to the complex interactions between parts and the fact that they would focus too much on individual parts. So if the thing that was broken was like one part of the radio was like kind of visibly broken, then biologists would probably figure out that and know how to fix it. But if it's anything more complex, kind of interactions between multiple parts or something that's not visible, he didn't have a lot of hope, was my read on that. And then he tries to explain why, and we were alluding to this before, and he claims that an engineer could fix a radio. And his explanation for the difference between a biologist and an engineer and why one could fix it and one couldn't is the language that they use, respectively. And I think we have feelings about this argument. I know I have feelings about this argument. But his main argument is, engineers have a unified, concrete language that they describe things in. It's quantitative, it's clear, it's kind of module, you can build things up. Whereas biologists speak in vague qualitative terms. They draw like box and arrow diagrams that are focused on their favorite protein and the millions of other things it interacts with, but it's not like a mechanistic diagram. And this was his explanation for why a biologist couldn't fix a radio. And I think that that's silly, but I want to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, I also didn't like that.
My first response was that it seemed relatively reasonable. So I'm actually curious to hear your guys' scathing criticisms.
No, I think it was like a bait and switch or something. Like the state of things that he set up was, I thought, more this like alien thing. You're handed a radio, you know nothing about anything, basically, and you're trying to figure out how it works. And then in the end, he's like, well, an engineer who has like training in engineering and in electrical engineering would be cool. Like, they could do it. Well, yeah, like they were trained on how it works. I'm trying to figure out how it works from scratch.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I feel like you guys are reading the course of this article like too literally, or certainly more.
Well, that's the whole point of the article.
That's what the problem with biology is, that you're handed something that no one knows how it works, and you need to figure out how it works. Like, I completely agree that we would do better if we had a more formal quantitative language, but that's not the core issue.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this was a bit of an editorial satire, like meant to provoke, and it was meant to make a few different points. Like, the first point about these sort of phases is like, yeah, there's going to be booms and busts in academic cycles, and it's often going to be precipitated by the fact that things are oversimplified. Here's a radio. How would a biologist approach a radio? And then, cue satire of the dysfunctional social dynamics of biology and the overly naive approaches that people bring to it. And it's like, here, what's my suggestion? We be a bit more rigorous in how we approach the reverse engineering of this. We come at it with design principles that we believe we understand. We accept sort of common language and stop following sort of leads as though they're like a silver bullet, which people have a tendency to do in biology, like pretend that one finding is really going to be the thing, when in fact it's all like part of a reverse engineering process. Yeah, those are some of my points. I
agree with most of this, but it was really the formalism argument that or having people agree on definitions. I mean, it's really hard to get a group of independent researchers to agree on anything, even like the basic definition of something. And coming from like mathematics, it's really difficult to come up with a very good definition that's going to last for a very long time, that's very precise. And just think about like the way that we used to name different like cortical regions and how that's changed as we have better and better tools in order to be able to demarcate different areas and in a modular structure.
Yeah, his argument was like, oh, engineers are handed a formalism that they then use, which, like, yeah, that's great. If you can be handed a formalism that works for the thing you're doing, obviously we would prefer that. But the point of science, this is like the difference between engineering and science, is that science is trying to create the formalism. It's trying to figure out what the important parts are and kind of set them into groups and say how they interact.
Exactly. And in the absence of, I'm going back to paradigms, in the absence of like a very strong paradigm that's like kind of agreed upon by the entire field, then different pockets of the community within systems neuroscience are going to have different formalisms within them. And so I think that's why people are not going to agree across a field for specific definitions. And that's why there is this fuzziness, I think.
I think the way I would approach it is a little bit differently, and I accept that there's, very concrete differences between engineering as a discipline and science as a discipline. But I actually like the language component of it, because I think that there is a dysfunctional degree across many sciences, not just like within neuroscience, but like across fields, of redundantly naming things. Right? Like there are fundamental methods in statistics that statisticians developed at various points, like some method from the 70s, that then like economists and econometrics people and psychologists and neuroscientists and electrical engineers all use like the same technique and call it something relatively different. And there's this weird sort of sloppiness, in part because people are trying to resell things as new frequently, whereby people don't bother to allow like their language to cohere. And this is true even within fields, to some degree, and it's, more true across fields. And maybe within engineering, certainly certain forms of engineering or certain key disciplines, people are a bit clearer when they're, making a new method, or like if there's a social pressure for people to be well versed in a certain kind of language. Maybe statistics does a decent job of this in certain respects. Maybe certain subfields of math do a decent job of this. Maybe computer science does a decent job of this. They sort of police their terminology a bit in a way where you can't get away with a kind of intellectual sloppiness when it comes to saying what you're doing or describing your method or describing the model you're making. Getting back to this concretely, biologists at the time of this being written, I think, were probably rightly being criticized for a kind of reductionism, where they weren't really building things back up constructively because they weren't building precise enough models. And if you're going to make flow diagrams, or the flow charts, or like relationship diagrams that are qualitative based on experimental knockouts, you can't expect that to be a reasonable description of a system as the system that you're trying to describe gets fairly big. So you need to have language to describe that. And maybe in the case of regulatory networks, as physicists have done in the mid to late 2000s, they start formalizing, like physicists come in and say, yeah, let's just use certain kinds of, mathematical functions to describe the relationship for gene regulatory networks or messaging systems within cells.
I mean, as I said, I completely agree with the fact that biologists would benefit from the use of quantitative language, and that the way things are described normally is like completely insufficient. And he says the lack of this quantitative language is what leads to this paradoxical time where more information doesn't help you because it's just like a bunch of individual like word statements that people are making, and there's no way to unify them, and there's no way to talk about kind of different regimes of a system, if something is operating under different circumstances, how that interacts in a very complex way to produce results that you could still predict if you had the right quantitative model. I just didn't care for that as the reason why a biologist couldn't fix a radio, because I think it's part of the reason, but the main reason is because no one told them how electrical circuits work, and they didn't have a language specifically designed to talk about electrical circuits, and that's what they would be trying to create if they were doing a good job of it.
So, but I mean, again, like looked at from a certain perspective, narrowly critiquing the somewhat bait and switch tactic of the article, I think you're making a legitimate point. But if you look at the function of this article instead, the author's clearly trying to say, what would a biologist do if given a radio they didn't know what to do with? And they would kind of make a fool of themselves. And what's like the minimal set of advice we would give to such people come at it from an engineering perspective because it's an engineered system. And I don't think that this analogy holds totally well for biology, because biology isn't an engineered system. I mean, I kind of agree with you, but like in the case of a radio, you can kind of laugh at what a biologist might naively do, and instead say like, here's what you probably should do instead. And there's a clear answer. I think what you should do is a bit less clear, though maybe you can take some lessons from what an engineer might do to solve a radio, in the case of real systems that we don't understand rather than engineered systems.
But I think that's one of the issues with papers or editorials like this, is that they often have very good points, but then it feels kind of lacking at the end when you're like, well, what am I supposed to do as a biologist?
Well, that's funny because, so as I said, we read this in grad school, and that was like, a few years ago now. And in my mind, this was a paper that demonstrated how difficult biology is. When in reality, its message is biologists should learn to code and to think quantitatively and not be afraid of math. Like, that's kind of what he says exactly at the end.
I mean, the final sentence is, biologists better be ready to learn how to code.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of neuroscientists who code and
this
still don't understand.
Well, we'll get to that, I think. So in 2002, I think that was like a fairly new message. Obviously, by the time we were like growing up in the system, it was much more like a lot of people were making that same argument. But yeah, to me, this paper was about like, if you have something that you don't know how it works, it's really hard to even know how to start to figure out how it works. And that's kind of the state that scientists are in. And I didn't even remember that the conclusion was learn how to code, which is ironic because like I am a theoretical person. So like you'd think that I would remember if a paper was making a strong argument for that. So that's why like, yeah, the way that this little setup impacted me was like quite different, despite the fact that I completely agree that you need a quantitative language to help. Like, you will definitely not get it done if you don't have that.
And I feel like this is maybe the low-hanging point that you guys are overlooking. Like, all three of us are relatively quantitatively literate, and literate also at using programming languages. And to like, the guy's making a fairly weak point in my mind, which is like, if people are trying to study a complex system and they can neither write math nor analyze data quantitatively, how are you going to make progress in that way? And that's kind of the thing that he's throwing his hands up at. And so this should be an easy message, in my opinion, for like us all to get on board with. I mean, there are sort of second order things about this paper that maybe are worth sort of poking holes in. But like the very superficial thing that's being messaged, I feel like it feels like something we should all kind of be strongly behind, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I think I am, and I think Grace also. I mean, I like the paper.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, just the...
I think I wanted an answer to the other part. Like, okay, I agree, we should have a quantitative language, but now, like, what else? Like, we're still kind of in a shit situation. Like, should I still do ablations? Like, what should I be doing to build that quantitative model? He also was talking about how people object to this view that, or at least at the time, like, biologists were like, no, quantitative languages won't help us. They claimed that biology is too complicated for quantitative language, which I think seems kind of obviously silly because that's when you need it the most. Like, that's when you need to be precise, as if you're dealing with something that's very complex. But then he also talked about the Youre syndrome, which I hadn't heard of, or apparently I did the first time I read this, but I had forgotten, which is when they realized that you could synthesize urea in a lab. Like, the idea that you can synthesize an organic compound was very surprising to people because they kind of viewed life as having this, this essence to it, and you wouldn't be able to synthesize it. And so he was saying that people have that kind of argument to the use of math in biology. Like, simple mathematics and calculations couldn't capture, the essence of life. I want to believe that people are past those kinds of objections.
Yeah, so, I mean, if I strongly editorialize now for yet another moment, I think there is an implied takeaway here, which is not just use a formal language, but to develop like a set of theoretical tools or like quantitative frameworks for constructing systems, right? Like, an engineer can reverse engineer a radio in part because they have built radios, and I think implicit in the urge to engage in engineering style approaches when understanding cells or the nervous system is the idea that you'll have to understand constructively how to design systems that function similarly to those that we see in nature. To understand how urea is created biochemically in the body, perhaps it's useful that we can synthesize urea outside of the body. Similarly, if we want to understand how a bird learns to sing a song by listening to its tutor sing a song repeatedly, or how a bird learns to fly, if we can build little robots or little, sort of embodied, animals, artificial animals that can do these kinds of things, we'll have the tool set, theoretically and practically, to reverse engineer how little biological animals do the things that they do. So, this is a strong nudge towards the kind of research that I find most compelling right now.
I'm not completely sold that we need to be able to engineer the system in order to reverse engineer it. I don't think that's logically necessarily true, but I think that it really helps.
And it's a good way to test your hypotheses along the way.
Yes, yeah.
Exactly. And we're talking about physically building stuff, but also just that's what the quantitative language is for. You could simulate the system or physically build it or whatever, but you need to be able to say concretely how you think it works. And the only way you can say concretely anything is some formal quantitative language. Okay, so we can talk briefly about the microprocessor paper, which is a more concrete attempt at the, I guess, by Josh's view, satirical, not meant to be taken seriously endeavor of the radio. They take it seriously, and they try to apply neuroscience techniques to a microprocessor. So this paper, they use, it's a simulation of a microprocessor that was used to run Atari games, and it produces 1.5 gigabytes of data per second if you're just kind of recording what all the transistors are doing in it. And they just take that and interpret it as neural data. So there's kind of when the transistor switches on or off is kind of like a spike or activity of the unit. And there's, a physical layout to it. So there's some structures there, and there's the way that they all interconnect. And then they just apply a whole plethora of common neuroscience techniques. And I would say, the techniques they use are not very simple. They're some of the more advanced quantitative techniques. So we can talk about, in the light of the claim that quantitative formal language is what you need, we can ask if this is what is meant by that. It's interesting to me that they talk about a neuroscientist understanding a microprocessor and not specifically fixing. So they talk about what they mean by understanding, and basically they give Mars levels as the goal. So these are commonly talked about in neuroscience, the idea that you understand at the computational level what a system is for, what its goal is in some way. At the algorithmic level, the steps it takes to achieve that, and then at the implementation level, the physical things that implement the algorithm. So that is an interesting kind of way to frame what the goal is, or how you know if you've achieved something when you apply these different neuroscience methods, that I think does give it a different interpretation than something like, could you fix it? But so the things that they do are, they look at the connectome and do some analyses on the graph structure of how everything's connected. They do some lesions. They look at the tuning of the individual transistors. They look at correlations between them. They do an LFP oscillations analysis by kind of, I think, averaging over certain spatial areas. They do Granger causality, and they do dimensionality reduction. So a pretty good set of what neuroscientists might do.
So I have to say, going back to the point that I've made repeatedly about the other paper, that it felt somewhat satirical, this one also feels not totally serious.
And I think of course it's not totally serious.
Yeah, no, right, but I think that is maybe, from my perspective, this paper didn't feel like it was, it felt like a satire dressed up as something that was being serious. So it was just pretty hard satire, it stuck to its guns in being satirical. And I think the fact that they carried everything out doesn't really change that. That makes it in some ways an even stronger version of the kind of pure satire that in some ways it seems to me to be. It either reads satirical or straight, depending on how seriously you believe you can, and how seriously you believe the authors could see this as a good analogy for what the brain is like. So if the looking at this microprocessor does not to you feel like a very good metaphor for the brain or a good sort of an analogous system, then it kind of feels like they're poking fun at something. And if when you read this, it feels like, yeah, no, I accept that is a productive metaphor, then it feels less satirical because it's more like a straight methodological exposition. Like, we've done these different things and this is how informative they each seemed.
They are saying that people should validate methods on this kind of thing, of like a microprocessor. And I think they are trying to make claims that it has enough similarities to the brain. So they talk about, it's made up of similar units that are all connected. It has a modular structure and a hierarchical structure, and it works on different time scales. They are making comparisons to the brain. And I think the use of Mars levels as the goal and understanding is also a big assumption. I mean, those levels come from kind of thinking of the brain as a computer, but it's saying something about how they believe this system works if you're even going to claim that you could understand it in those levels. Obviously, there's a lot of things in the world where we wouldn't really think to describe them on those levels. So I think they're claiming some similarity.
Yeah, I mean, there's another famous paper that people like to talk about where you scan a dead fish in an fMRI and you try to do analyses on it and you get spurious activations and things like this. And it requires adapting methods designed for neuroscience to, a dead fish, much smaller brain, and some of the things that they choose to do in it read satirical in certain ways. And I think in a lot of these cases, how tongue-in-cheek it is, again, depends on how sincerely you feel like they've engaged with the methods. So you can look at this and decide, like, I think that they applied this method with enough sincerity that it's informative for how people do neuroscience on real biological nervous systems. Or you can look at a specific example of their analyses and feel like that's not really a fair way of applying this method, or in a way that I feel like is theoretically not well motivated. This method doesn't really generalize in an intuitive way to the artificial system because some sort of assumptions or some sort of principles that are violated. And I realize they pay lip service to it, like transistors are nonlinear and neurons are nonlinear, or there's behavioral modes and there's behavioral modes in animals, or they do nod to a lot of these things, but you can again take those rebuttals seriously, or you can say yes, they've acknowledged the way that their thing could be misconstrued or should be misconstrued as satirical. I'm unclear, honestly.
But then why is it published if it's a significant amount of work? I think yes, they may be doing this in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way, but there's definitely a point to this paper, which is presumably, from what I understand, that these methods don't work in getting a satisfactory understanding of brain function.
Yeah, and they frame it as, people say that neuroscience is data limited, and if we just had more data, we'd be able to apply our methods and we'd get like good insights. And so their claim is this is a system where there's no limitations on data and we know how it works. And yeah, their takeaway is a bit in the direction of, this didn't lead to a satisfactory understanding. It was interesting though, because some of the methods performed better than I thought they would. Like the connectomic analysis did pull out transistors that were part of different functions, I think, and there were some other things that were just like, oh, well, that is aligned with components of the system. The dimensionality reduction found like the clock signal of the microprocessor and the read-write signals and stuff. So it was actually kind of better than I thought. I would say that I don't think that it's useful to validate your neuroscience methods on a simulated microprocessor because there are enough differences. And especially, they're using all these different methods that all have different assumptions about how the brain works. So ideally, you would make a model of a brain that builds in the assumptions that your data analysis method has as part of it and test it on that. Like custom make a model that's very clear about what needs to be true for this data analysis method to work, and then show that it works on that and show the range of generating models that your analysis will work on so that people know that they can apply it under certain circumstances and not under other circumstances. I think that's a more productive route than just taking the microprocessor as a stand-in, because there are differences between how microprocessors work and how the brain works, or how we believe that the brain works. Like basically find that your methods have assumptions built in and are based on previous findings about the brain. I kind of get the sense that, like, oh, if it doesn't work on a microprocessor, then it's not good for understanding the brain, and I don't agree with that.
But what you say about what's previously known about the brain, I mean, I think that's super important. It's something that's not really explicitly discussed that much in this paper, is how many of these techniques have been used because they're showing that previous assumptions were incomplete in some way. And so just to use the example of correlations, because that's what I'm most familiar with from my PhD work, I mean, the reason that looking at population spiking patterns and like fitting them to maximum entry models and seeing how correlations have an effect, the reason that's important is because previously people had been characterizing the single neuron firing rates and tuning properties without looking at how neurons are correlated because, before they could just record from single neurons at a time. And it turned out that the correlations could very dramatically affect the population level activity or the amount of information that could be encoded in these populations. So it actually does make sense from that point of view. If you're thinking about neuroscience as a process and as a history, rather than as like a set of methods that we learn and just blindly apply to something now, then I think it does make a lot of sense that people were doing that.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And, you can say, I think, so they talk also about the oscillations findings and how there's kind of power at different frequencies that you wouldn't expect. And it kind of looks like brain signals, but we know that it's not for the same reasons that people claim it's happening in the brain. But like, it's relevant what you already know about the system and what could plausibly be generating the thing that you're looking at, or why the thing that you're looking at might matter, like with the correlations. There can be specifics for how we think the brain works that make those matter, that make them not matter in the microprocessor, or make the interpretation just completely different. Like, this is just applying data analysis, but that's nothing. Like, that's not science. You have to then look at the outcome and interpret it in light of what you know about the system. And that's going to depend on what you know about the system. And so it's going to mean different things in different systems. The same outcome of the same analysis will mean something different based on what you think is true about the system. So I was interested to see the outcomes of all these different analyses and stuff and see what could be recovered. But it wouldn't convince me to use or not use any one of them in particular, just because what matters to me is how they're interpreted in light of other things I believe about the brain.
And I think that that issue of interpretation is so key. Now going back to the previous paper where they kind of end with this idea that this formalism is really what's lacking in systems biology. And here in this paper, they're showing that you can use that formalism and apply it to this microprocessor, and that still doesn't really give you any satisfactory answers. So maybe having better methodology, both formalism and experimental techniques would help. But also I think what is really missing is that interpretation, insight, asking new good questions. And that's why it's so hard also.
Yeah, and it's why, like, of course you're not going to understand a microprocessor in a single paper. Like, if we really wanted to use these methods as a starting point to understand a microprocessor, you might get somewhere if you had a bunch of people working on it for a bit. It's a starting point that you then have to build on. You have to synthesize, you have to interpret these and synthesize them. And I really think in the first paper, the type of formalism that he's talking about isn't necessarily like fancier quantitative methods. It's model building. It's like saying, I think that the way this system works is that A connects to B and that leads to C and so on. And that's not what this paper was. I don't think that they...
Just to be clear, it's quantitative model building, right?
Yeah.
For the first paper. So it's not just that A leads to B and B leads to C. It's propose a specific mathematical model in which that is the structure of the relationship.
Yeah, I can only say word models, but I mean math when I say that.
A leads to B with probability P.
Sure. But yeah, so I feel like the first paper was calling for quantitative model building, or at least that's how I read it, not just fancier data analysis. And I don't think the motivation for using this data analysis in the microprocessor paper was that that's how they interpreted the radio one. I think it's orthogonal to that. But I'm just saying that fancy data analysis isn't the same as a good formal model of how you think the system works. Anything else?
Do you think we're making progress?
In life? In neuroscience?
Like how... Yeah.
I honestly can't tell. Sometimes in subfields, yeah.
I can't tell either. Sometimes I feel like we are, and sometimes...
Well, we, I suppose, haven't been in the field by academic standards. We're, like, young. So maybe we need to be in it longer to see the trajectory.
Yeah, to see that it's going to be one big circle. No, I'm kidding.
We go back to thinking that it's like gases going through chambers or something. Humors. Okay, till next time. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast? Give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.